on this show today is someone who has spent years building bridges between cultures, communities, and conversations. From understanding the nuances of identity to helping brands genuinely connect with diverse audiences, his journey is as much about business as it is about belonging. Here and Now 365 was founded by him 20 years ago. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my dear friend Manish Tiwari, Managing Director of Here and Now 365. Hi, Manish. Thank you for joining
Hello,
us.
Lakshmi. Thank you. And I think that was one of the best intros I've ever heard about me in less than 2 minutes. So, like, really well done. And I'm so
Thank you.
happy for you to do that.
Thank you. It helps to know your guest personally. It helps to know their journey. So thank you for that. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So how are you feeling?
Well, yeah, I mean, the weather is good. As they say, if the weather is good in London, you feel happier. And so it is right now.
So London's home now for you, isn't it?
Yeah, London has been home literally for, I would say, the last 25 years, literally. Yeah. I mean, out of which 2 years are spent in the north. So about 23 years, London has been pretty much
So
everything
let's say
for
UK's
me.
been home for you for more.
UK has been home for 25 years. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So take us back a little bit. What did home mean to you growing up, and how has that shaped the way you think about identity today? What were some of your early struggles, financial, cultural, or even internal, that perhaps people don't see today because you're a successful businessman?
Definitely. So, home obviously is the place where you were born. I mean, the first idea of home is always the place you were born. And then someone like me who studied in different places, lived in different cities, and in my adult life, I constantly kept moving from one place to another. So, the idea of home kind of evolves. It becomes more like the anchor in your life, what you've been doing. It's, for so rightly or wrongly, I associate home more with the kind of work I'm involved with. So that sounds more like home rather than a physical structure. But since you asked me, I think I have to start from the beginning. So I would say home was the place in India where I was born, and that happens to be a place in central India. It's a city called Raipur, which where I studied, did my schooling, and then moved on to do my different courses. So first it was engineering, and then a degree in mass comm from Multicultural Communication, which is in Ahmedabad. So yeah, so all that journey culminated in Bombay, where I started working, and for the long time that was the locus of my life. I had to be a Mumbaiker, as they say. I lived and worked there, and then eventually I moved to London. For me, the struggle in life really started when I started living in Bombay because I could see what the challenges of real life are in the sense that living in a big metropolis where you have a political undercurrent, which you can't completely isolate yourself from. And then you see this kind of identity. The first idea of identity for me happened in Mumbai because before then I never even thought who I was in those terms. People would stick a label onto you. So like in India, it happens that people would say that, oh, your name is this, so you are a Brahmin or you are from, so all those tags come to you automatically and you don't like them because that was not the idea of us. So, you want to be known by what you have contributed or what you have done. But then all that changed in Bombay because there I could see that there was a different kind of struggle because your name meant something more than that. I mean, this is what I imagine it to be like. It is much lesser than that what I imagined it to be. So there's absolutely no culture shock. In fact, there was far too much comfort in being in the UK whenever you met an Indian community. And in the initial days when I was studying, when really I didn't had much not much kind of interaction with Indian community, which was at that time primarily the local white community. Even then, I could find those common areas. So, for example, in those days, I could see that there were enough number of people interested in Indian spirituality, meditation, and I could find and access that community very easily. And I could find a common ground. So, which was simply great because it didn't need people of Indian origin. It just needed that common understanding that, yeah, there is something like this, which happens to have that Indian origin because India is big on those things. And because of that, you could access a different world, a business world, where obviously new things emerge and you kind of become aware of it. When I moved to England, I think I became cautious because I knew that someday, sooner or later, I would need money. So, you automatically become very conscious and you would not spend that. So you kind of have that mindset wherein whatever you have, you kind of spend out of that very judiciously. So life worked out in that sense in the UK. Yeah.
So, was there like a defining moment when you realized you wanted to build something of your own? Because he said you went to Mumbai for a job and then
Yeah.
that transition to UK. Did you build something from the beginning?
Yeah. So look, when you are young and you have imagination, so for me, like the longest time when I was studying and when I was studying advertising, which was completely, you know, not something which you often do in India. And for me, that was the area I wanted to get into. You imagine what your working life would be. So quite honestly, coming from a certain background, I used to imagine that, yeah, once I get into advertising, it would be very glamorous. It would be all kind of meeting and talking with people who you would not normally get access to. And you'd be creating something which would be kind of creating thought waves in other people's minds. So you have all these conceptions and very easily forgetting that the advertising is just a business like any other business. It's essentially a business which has all this kind of layers, but you don't access it straight away. So for me, it was a bit of like, when I stepped into it, I was very enthusiastic and I was doing those things. And I wanted someone to make me sit down and say, oh, what ideas you have? What are your thoughts? But nothing of that kind happens for a very long time. You're just getting artworks and you're doing deadlines and you have, a team which is trying to create revenues. So you're doing their bidding essentially. So I thought at least there has to be an outlet. So let me try and spend time writing. So I created a play. Fortunately, I used to go to British Council, which was in the office area where I was working, which was in the Express Towers. So British Council was every evening in NCPA because I had, due to Indian Express, a lot of access to number of things which happened in those days. And then I got to know about a playwriters workshop for South Asians hosted by British Council, where you have three very well-known playwrights from UK, from Royal Court Theatre, who were hosting this in Bangalore. And I kind of saw that and I went there and spent 2 months. I don't know how. I can't even spend 1 week now outside office, but in those days, 2 months. So, all that happened. And then when I thought, like, let me take a break from Bombay. So I just, because I had access to British Council, the automatically, the idea which was in my head was that, look, I've worked with these guys. Britain looks like the place where you have a lot of room for creativity and writers. It was just association. So I just came here to study and explore. And while doing all that, it became clear that money doesn't come by writing. I mean, it takes a long time again. So that's how I was very clear that I have to start something at some stage. And I was late in the day because I was by then in my 30s. So, I couldn't just do a job. I tried doing that as well. I tried in publishing. I worked in different places and I tried all that, but it was becoming increasingly clear that I'm not that 20 something anymore and I would not be doing that kind of a job. So I had to start on my own. And this whole multicultural marketing, advertising, it was just a lot of coincidences because if you remember when I came, it was the 2000s, the what do you call the noughties, when you had the Blair era here in the UK, in London. And Blair era was very phenomenal because it was all about New Britain. And Blair optimized or at least represented that whole aspiration of people to create a new country, which also accepted as multicultural associations because the empire, South Asians, all those things were automatically assimilated in the UK. By then, the racism of the early 70s and 60s had kind of disappeared. Not disappeared, but at least it was a thing of the past. And it was no more something which would that way hugely be out there. It was there, but it was a lore of the past. So New Britain represented something huge and important to kind of create a new direction for this country. And in those days, multicultural aspirations in terms of art were accepted. There were a lot of groundbreaking work which happened. And the government also accepted that all government comms also have to have a multicultural part to it. And they created something called COI, Central Office of Information, where you had the big agency, the big campaigns, but also wherever there was a need, there was also an ask for pitching as a multicultural agency. And that I think gave us a lot of grounding because we enrolled and we got accepted. Our enrollment was successful into COI. And then it gave us access to a lot of public sector work, some of which we did very successfully, geared towards multicultural audiences, which was South Asian and other audiences. So it was a good beginning and it gave us a good grounding. And at the same time, the India story happened. So I think India story is very important post 2000 because for the first time you had Indian businesses. For example, ICICI Bank, it opened in our time. And I was like, a bit twinned in a way that what ICICI was doing, we were helping them with. And similarly, there were other brands like Airtel launched it didn't stay here, but they tried to be in this market. And so many other Indian businesses started slowly opening up in the UK. And I mean, now it's an accepted thing. India is one of the big investors in London. I think the second largest investor, literally, and the trade thing is there for everyone to see. But in those days, that was the beginning. So all these things just gave us the right kind of fuel to create what we created, an agency which was stepping into all these different kind of clienteles who were trying to make a mark in the UK. And yeah, I mean, that's how this whole idea of multicultural advertising agency came in. It looked into the South Asians. It also looked into West Africans. It looked into the public sector here. And then eventually we started focusing on the British brands who were trying to target different diaspora. And in all this, in those days also, there was less, like even, for example, the whole South Asian identity was still acceptable to a large extent. So, now you have a bit more sharper divisions between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But in those days, I think the whole South Asian identity, like we would be termed as Asians, unlike now the lingo is a bit more like national identity. So, Indians is different. But in those days, for the longest time in the UK, Asians, and even now, broadly means South Asians. I don't know. This is kind of Asians is supposed to mean a lot many more people, but over here it ended up meaning South Asians. So all these things happened, and that's how the agency kind of found its grounding, and we started working in the UK. Yeah.
Multicultural marketing often gets reduced to stereotypes. How do you avoid that trap in your line of work?
No, that's a very good question, Lakshmi, because I just got to be one of the 30 people. There's a thing called which IPA, which is Institute of Practitioners of Advertising in the UK. They roll out every 2 years. So it's called iList. And I'm on the iList this year. So basically among the 30 change makers. And if I can play the identity card, I'm the only possible Indian in those 30 change makers who are changing the advertising industry in the UK. And among those, I have to say that I'm very vocal against stereotyping and what we call tick box exercise. So, the whole thing about being woke and being kind of this whole thing about tick box, has come through as a way to uh, accept identity, but it's not acceptance really. It's just kind of saying that, yeah, I mean, you exist. So we find a way to just kind of put you there somewhere. But
More
we don't
tokenism.
really, it's more tokenism. Yeah. And my work has completely been against that at every stage. And sometimes because of that, some clients don't want to get into it because they don't want to do the hard work. They had rather do something which is window dressing if needed and not really do the hard work. So I'm totally against that. And our work has shown to that extent. Some of the good work which we've done, for example, with a brand called Vatika, which is again part of Dabur. And Dabur, is a big FMCG brand from India. So they've done a lot of work in the last few years. For example, one of the campaigns which we got an award for from Marketing Week was about gender pay gap. And gender pay gap, when coupled with identity of a Black or Indian or ethnic person, is even worse because what is happening here is that people just trying to get into a role wherein they've been outside a professional role or they've not been, into a job scenario. When they get into a job scenario, they get exploited. So while if you're white, obviously the white privilege works. But if you are a Black or Indian or ethnic, it can be worse. In particularly in many areas, which are also, let's say, things like, I mean, you would have heard about it all. Like there are like sweatshops which employ people of color and they exploit. And so it is in many other informal economy sectors where the exploitation is huge. But it's not just there, it's there in big companies and big jobs as well, because you're not easily given the leadership role. So we did this campaign and that I think is very meaningful because we talked about not just identity, but the impact of the identity on the outcome. And similarly, we have picked up issues like, for example, we did talk about, Vatika did do a campaign on queer people like people who have, they have the love from the family. So we did a campaign about LGBT community who have love from the family, but the family doesn't want to own them. They don't want to come out and say that this is my son or daughter. But these are real issues, and these are out there and very specific to Indian and other South Asian communities. So we've done work like that, which is a lot more depth and which is not easily acceptable either. And the last campaign which we've done on this front, which actually we funded ourselves, is a campaign called The Missing. And The Missing is about the sex ratio, the gender sex ratio, which has gone wrong within Indian community in particular. So the average boy-girl ratio in the UK happens to be 104 to 100 in favor of boys. But within the Indian community, it is astoundingly high, which is 118 boys to 100 girls. Now, there's a huge imbalance. Thankfully, that imbalance doesn't even exist in India now. In India, things have improved a lot because of tighter regulations and what has happened historically. But in the diaspora, and in particular in the UK, some of these things have carried on, though you're not supposed to legally abort because of gender. So gender selective abortion is illegal, but people manage to do that. And most likely it's trying to find that male heir to your family. Even in big business families, they want someone who's going to be taking over the business, and the girls are fine, but they need to have that male heir who's going to literally be the flagship of the business. So those kind of practices still continue within the Indian community. So with all its merits, with all its kind of big shout about what they have achieved, I mean, it's an achiever community big time, but on some basic things, they continue to fail. So this is the kind of work which we're doing, other than obviously the very hard-nosed commercial work which needs to be done. But my point here is that when you are talking about multicultural, like you said, typically it ends up being stereotyping. Typically it ends up putting a woman in a hijab because for some reason that's seen as multicultural. I mean, I don't buy into those kind of things. And even, I had a message for the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, because she went on record saying that she thinks multiculturalism has failed. But to the contrary, multiculturalism has succeeded. What has been the failing is this kind of stereotyping. It actually represents different ways of living culturally. It doesn't necessarily represent different religions, because religions are a different issue altogether. There's a faith thing. And while I have every sympathy for people, because people don't necessarily choose what they're being born into, so we have to accept them for their faiths, and we have to bring out the best in every faith, because there are malpractices everywhere. So it's not exclusive to a religion. There are a lot of dogmatic issues with every religion which need to be addressed. But it's not a multicultural issue. Faith is a completely different thing. And faith, when it becomes hard-nosed and extremely conservative, is creating the kind of problems which we see in terms of wars. You see, I mean, I don't have to tell you what's happening in the world. So you have those kind of conflicts which are hugely driven by monotheistic identity and faith-driven ideology. Has nothing to do with multiculturalism. In fact, I very strongly think that if you truly have multicultural societies, like you have also a lot in the UK, it is very hard, very, very hard for people to become monotheistic and to take on those roots, because they have to accept every day on their high streets, in their neighborhoods, in their schools, that people have different ways of living. People can be vegan, vegetarian, people can have identity based on how they dress, differently. So automatically it brings a lot of acceptance. People have different kinds of music, dance, you know. And this is what a good multicultural society does. It makes you sensitive to these things, and there's less of dogma. But unfortunately, societies where they have wiped out every other faith and just created a monotheistic way of living, they just reinforce, and through fear, they reinforce this through fear of hell and heaven, or whatever you call it. And then, those societies are being called multicultural. I mean, I'm just like, hang on, that's not multicultural at all. That's monotheistic and single faith. Yeah. Multicultural is about having different ways and coexisting. So there's a lot of, I would say, misunderstanding around these terms. And the way I see is that advertising also has to come from, different sources have to come to create things. And to some extent, things like that exist also in India, because you have different regions who have very different way of expressing everything, different music, different food. So somehow that acceptance is somehow built into societies. And I think in Europe and UK, there has been a constant effort to encourage that. But now where people are calling out that, oh, there's multiculturalism of failure, they're just kind of, they're driving a bogey to scare people. And you ask the same people, so what is your idea of an ideal society? And they don't have a clue. They will say, oh, we are a Christian country. I said, yeah, nothing wrong with being a Christian country, but what exactly is this? Are the people really believe in that? Do the people really believe in Christianity? Because these are societies which, in true extent, have moved on from there, have evolved into so many different ways of being. So they're not truly Christian in the faith terms, because that's not acceptable by people. So there's a loss of complete identity. Then they are swinging and saying that, no, we have a national identity, which was our identity, like, XYZ, which is, and I said, that's also not true. So you have a vacuum here. You have a vacuum here because what you're not accepting is that, yes, we can have a different way of being, different societies. So rather than evolving, you're kind of regressing, and you're trying to create kind of this whole fear mongering about people from different cultures. But that's not constructive. It's not going to work that way either. It's just, you just have to go back a little bit and see the conflicts for yourself: Catholic versus Protestant, or a region versus another region, or a class versus another class. So the conflicts are already there. It's just that the prosperity and the good times we had post World War II has overcome all that. And now you have a challenge where you have people who look different are being part of the society. And some of them are, again, bringing out issues which are not good. Maybe they are radicalizing in different ways. So rather than tackling that in a constructive way, we can't go back and say that, look, this is a failed state. We are going to go back to war. So I think there's some honest conversations in the society needed, and a multicultural society is a reality. We can't get away from that.
So you bear a lot of burden in terms of that responsibility, because you're building perspectives, you're building an educational grounding of what multicultural societies are. I mean, you are helping the consumer, the brands, the businesses, the governments, perhaps everybody's a consumer today, helping them understand what multiculturalism really truly means and what it ought to mean. Do you think UK brands truly understand India, or are they still looking at it through a Western lens?
I think a lot of good work has happened. And I must say that the institutions which we have, including, for example, the Indian High Commission and the trade bodies, you were part of CII. So, you've done a lot of good work in that sense. So there's a lot of concerted effort, at least in the London, Delhi, and let's say India, UK sector, wherein a lot of people come and go. So there's a lot of understanding because of that people to people connect has driven a huge amount of shift in how people think about India now. India is also a tech country, a tech nation, a technology driven enterprise. And I mean, I think we talked about it long back, but I did a white paper recently which talked about how the UK has leveraged Indian workers from the tech sector to become the third largest tech superpower in the world. And it's not an old thing. It all started as old as recent as 20 years back, or less than that, 2009, when Gordon Brown actually invited a lot of second tier Indian IT companies to come here and explore, because they were far behind Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley had already taken over the world by then. And then since then, the migration pattern has been driven around this. A lot of Indian tech and IT companies successfully operate in the UK, delivering some of the big and vital projects. And now in things like AI, software development, all the new tech areas, almost, and this is what the white paper showed us, like almost 15 of the tech workforce in the UK is Indian born. I'm saying Indian born. It's not even Indian origin. So Indian origin might be propelling it more than 20%. So that's a significant impact which people from India are having in the UK in rebuilding the economy, in kind of, what was it line, make Britain great again. So they're actually the ones behind it. And even in terms of soft power, they're the ones who are actually, who's driving cricket is Indians. That's British soft power. That's not Indian soft power. That's British soft power. Who reads, PG Woodhouse? I mean, the High Commissioner, the outgoing High Commissioner, he was a patron of the PG Woodhouse Society here. I mean, who has that kind of, in-depth understanding of British soft culture and soft power? It's people from universities in India who are driving those things. We read a lot more British writers than anywhere, anyone else. I mean, even in the UK, you'll struggle to find people who have read a lot of British classics. Of course, there's a certain population, but not a big number. I mean, Roald Dahl is still well known in India. So those kind of things, like areas where British soft power is being taken global, is primarily people from the subcontinent. A lot of it is to do with Indians. They're global. Wherever they are, they're playing cricket, whether it's Netherlands or USA. They're building cricket stadiums. The big moguls of tech in Silicon Valley, they have made their personal contribution by building stadiums of cricket in those countries. And same thing is with the language. So there's a, I would say all these things have definitely shifted perception of what India is. If you want to play cricket, you want to play in IPL. So anyone, so those little things has changed a lot. UK is an outpost for India to that extent that it celebrates whatever India has. And for people here, they, I think, finally are appreciative to a big extent about what Indians have done. There's an understanding to that extent. And I would not like to kind of bring in any kind of divisive narrative saying that it's this community is good and that community is not good. It's not like that. Is definitely not like that. But yes, definitely things have happened where certain people in certain communities have been misled. Up north, things have happened. They've been misled. They have had bad leadership or bad kind of, it's always how the leadership is. And when we're doing the white paper, we realize that subsequent generations of Indians who migrated to the UK, they all have a similar pattern. They all focused on their children's education, whether it was the blue collar migration of the 50s or the Idi Amin driven Uganda migration or the 90s when Manmohan Singh opened the economy. Every generation who has come here has leveraged their understanding of education system because we somehow have some basics which are similar to India and UK. They focused and put energy into educating their community to a large extent and made sure that they come out and do well. Every subsequent generation has done better than before. So now you have the average median income of Indians in the UK, which is highest. It's supposed to be somewhere close to 204,000. And this is an LSE report, independent report. White British is 164,000. So there's a gap. And the point here is, again, we don't want to build a narrative that Indians earn more or, it's not necessarily that, but it's the focus of the community is how the direction which it has taken because the people who came here had the right values and it's proven consecutively. So it's not just that only people who came here like were doctors who did this. No. So even the blue collar workers who came in the 1950s who built the things like Heathrow Airport physically, manually, even their children, all of them have done really well. They have gone up in what you call social mobility, have contributed significantly in every area of British life. So this is what a great story is, in terms of building this country. And eventually, this is how even people here have started looking at India as a talent hub, as a place from where people have come and contributed. And it's like one of the best stories you would ever see in terms of migration. So when you have even a story about negative story about migration, you would see that not necessarily Indians are part of it. In fact, unfortunately, I would say that Indians have not taken on their responsibility in terms of social life. That's, I think, where there's a gap. They're not taken on the responsibility in terms of their contribution to politics and other areas where they should be in trying to resolve and solve some of the basic problems we have in this country in UK. So in terms of contributing, I think they need to do more. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. There is definitely a need for more South Asians to be involved in politics, particularly
Yeah.
people from India.
Particularly
Um,
Indians. Yeah.
when you're designing campaigns for your clients, obviously there are many nuances that you understood over a period of time. There are things that you get right, which is why you dominate the market today. What is that one cultural nuance between the UK and India that, if
Mhm.
misunderstood, can completely derail a campaign in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, what happens is there's a tendency sometimes that we patronize, and especially Indians, they don't want to be patronized anymore. So even if they're new migrants or, someone what we call fresh off the boat, they don't want to be told in a certain way, that which was acceptable before. So, as a history of few hundred years, there was a certain thing there, that colonizer and the colonized, and all that was accepted and taken in a good spirit for a long time. But now the new generation is not going to take it, and no, and so are the people here. So you can't tell them. You have to kind of talk as equals. And I think, and it's both the sides. I think even sometimes, and I do see this thing, that some of the Indians also, when they think that the way they can conquer this market, is to kind of phrase or frame things in certain ways for British. So that is also not true. You have to talk with respect. With true respect. And I think definitely that patronizing thing has to go away. And so there are a lot of British brands who still selling a lot of Indian goods to, like Indian food stuff to Indians here. And I think they often lose that. There are great examples, like, for example, Patek's, which was an Indian brand, started by an Indian Gujarati family, pickles. It became so popular and part of the mainstream that now, it's acceptable everywhere. But slowly it has lost its ground with Indians, particularly, or South Asians. Because what happens is when you're building the brand in a certain way, you sometimes also tend to lose authenticity. It becomes a brand which was created for Indians or for South Asians, but then got accepted, and then they neutralized, or they brought down its core, and then it loses its market share. So there are things like that which happen definitely.
I mean, authenticity always sells better.
Authenticity,
I mean,
yeah,
it takes
authenticity
time, but
does,
it does sell
yeah,
better, and it holds its own
yeah.
beyond those initial teething sort of troubled periods of time. So, how do you see the multicultural media evolving in the next, say, decade or 2 decades? Noting that there's so much more awareness now, there's so much more access to information, people are traveling, the world is more connected and aware. How do you see the market itself, the multicultural media market evolving? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I think social media and now AI has done is it's kind of democratized media to a big extent. So you can make people, you can give them access, you can kind of bring them from nowhere and put them there. So it's kind of that whole democratic value of social media has taken over. And what AI is going to do is even take it to the next level, wherein, it doesn't need anything special to make someone celebrity for a few minutes. So all those things have been in the making. What also it has done, in a way, taken away the credibility of a lot of media. So the credibility which we used to have, wherein media was sacrosanct, especially when we saw it on broadcast or when we heard about it or when we read about it, I think that also has come down hugely. So people are not really sure what they're reading, how true it is, or what they're watching, whether it's manipulated or whether it's true. So all those things are happening. And I think that is the single largest factor which is going to be in future for media to be accepted by bigger numbers, which is credibility. How you build credibility into a media outlet. Yeah. When you have even now, I mean, there are a lot of questions on BBC as well, but BBC still, in spite of everything, happens to be a hugely credible media. Though there are sections of society which are questioning it now because they also seem to have a certain kind of bias again in certain situations. But even then, for a century almost, they seem to be having that kind of credibility wherein they're seen as someone who's giving you facts. And I think that's the direction in which multicultural media or media which has different origins, they need to be leading on, they need to lead on credibility, which is difficult currency, most of them. Because of political bias, because a lot of them have political affiliations. Also, social media is depending on who's the person behind it, who's doing the narrative. So it becomes hugely challenging. There are very few, like, for example, Mark Tully was a great voice who was respected by all. No one could have called him biased or representative of left, right, or center or whatever. All those lingos would not necessarily represent him because he truly was representing or was kind of, in many ways was very representative of when it came to India, of different people, of different sources. So similarly, I think with multicultural media, that I think is always a challenge, that you have not enough investment. Media is driven by agenda and it becomes more of a news carrier rather than a major influencer. So that is there, but the cultural currency is still there. So for example, if you have GeoStar or a Sony T or ZTV, they have a huge cultural currency which kind of permeates, or if you have a particular media from overseas, which is kind of trying to bring two cultures together. They seem to get that bit right because they have the cultural currency, culture validation. And what I have to yet see is a lot of them succeeding with huge following on social media, just the way you had all this mediums so far. But on social media, I do not see yet, like, let's say, a YouTube channel, which kind of has substantial following representing the diasporas. I think this yet to happen, I feel. So there's a challenge there.
Maybe that is because of the clash of identities. So
Mhm.
once you're an Indian in Britain and have become British Indian,
Mhm.
you've kind of become more British and you're trying to assimilate into the local culture. And therefore
Mhm.
you're trying to do more locally than than you would do otherwise, barring the cultural activities or events or celebrations and festivals. The day-to-day living is very British. It's more British because that's the country that you're living in. That's the home that you're making. Is there a failure or setback that may have genuinely shaken your confidence? And how did you recover?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't think too much about the failures, but definitely, I think the early on in my life, which is right when I started a career in advertising, I thought I should be able to create a space for me in that space, in what you call the creative space, where I'm able to express my ideas. And I always had ideas. So I personally feel that, yeah, I've been a failure in that sense, that early on in my life, I could not really convey that well enough. Yeah. I could not be convincing enough. I could not have that kind of maybe confidence to talk to people and say, look, listen to me, listen to my ideas. I was too kind of overwhelmed when I had those opportunities. So yeah, somewhere I think that was a failure. And much later in life, much later, which is now, I do feel the confidence that yes, I can say what I feel about and why I feel about certain things in certain ways. I do have the confidence now. I think it's a nationwide cultural issue which needs to be addressed. That how you kind of unleash the young energy of India. You know, it's easy to talk about it, but there's this the cultural construct is not helping. It is definitely not helping. Again, the demand of people to do the same jobs, to do get into that whole thing of bureaucratic jobs, which is now also into corporate world, to get find comfortable jobs and continue with that. Overwhelming demand for that, overwhelming demand for those kind of things, wherein people just want to be allowed to be part of that system, but not create something and not look at serious issues in serious ways. I mean, serious problems we have in India: pollution, environment, very serious problems. I mean, but there's no young energy going to that direction. There's no young energy going into direction which is into problem solving of any kind, and they're not getting any support either. So I think I took a personal question into a nationwide problem, but
No,
I
but we are
feel
all representations of
yeah,
our personality, our personal experiences definitely
yeah,
extend to the larger ecosystem. But I'm based out of India and I see a very different India now. I mean, the young voices are emerging. The young voices are very strong. I've been interacting with children in school, high school, even primary level students. They're also aspirational. There are innovators, and the schools are nurturing and encouraging that sort of spirit. They already have round one, round two of funding secured. Some of them, there are patents that they are getting. They're filing for their own ideas and things like that. So I suppose it's a tussle between the old and the new. The systems are still old, but the young energy is trying to break through, and it's probably just a matter of time that with AI, with fast tech, all of these things, young voices will break those barriers down and they will change the systems. Schools and educational systems will have to play a catch up game very, very soon. They already are, I suppose. There's so much information, there's an information overload. So I guess it's just a matter of time that a young Manish today will be able to have the confidence to say and speak their mind and deliver, maybe build this multicultural business much sooner than, wait for so long. I hope
yeah,
so. I hope that is the day that we will witness soon. So if you had to bet on one trend that will define the UK-India business relationship, what would
yeah.
that be?
Well, I think there is a small trend. It's very small, but there's a trend that the diaspora here, as well as some of the British, they are setting up things in India, and I think that was not there before. It was more a trend which was about coming to the UK that was the overwhelming investment demand as well as other things. But now there's a trend which is not corporate driven. I'm not saying corporate investment, that's easy. I'm not talking institutional investment, that's also easy. But I'm talking about investments of people for example, someone getting an idea about organic farming and trying that in India with a skill and a vision. Someone is those kind of things. I do see a trend like that. Someone investing into, let's say, tribal arts in India. A friend of mine has done that. It's called Dharohar art. And then they're representing them here. Those are kind of niche areas which, with the diaspora expertise and with their experience, and that they're with their success because, they're successful hugely and they're like doing so well. I mean, they're able to find these areas in India and tap into them and open it up. I think that's a trend, and I think that should be encouraged. I don't know who and how, what part institutions can play, but definitely. And I think that's something we can look forward to because then it will be a lot more I would say vibrancy because one thing is there that when companies invest, they're looking at different factors, and it's not necessarily. I mean, it might look like it's very good for the economy on both the sides, but it's not necessarily the case because they are essentially dealing with huge capital. So it doesn't necessarily create the vibrancy which we want. But when individuals are motivated to do things, that creates a different level of vibrancy because then they're loving the idea of doing it. They're not necessarily, it's not just a business, they are also into that idea, and then that kind of is transformative for both the sides, I think.
I think India is an emotional land, so you
Yeah,
have to
that's right.
connect with the emotion that is India first and
Yes.
foremost, and then sort of go through with the rest of it. So finally, Manish, what is on top of your mind today, and what are you excited about next?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's a very challenging time in a different way because we're talking about AI, we're talking about what can go wrong with businesses going forward, and the role of technology, which is so overwhelming. But where I do see a very interesting opportunity is that there is an acceptance of the idea which I have as a business. So even though it may be very challenging because advertising is a challenging industry, but I do see there's an acceptance, and that gives me a fresh confidence that yes, I can play a bigger role. I can have like tech AI as well as part of it and kind of go for the next phase in my life as a business, and also this whole optimism about India as well. So that also is because you see, when you look at the world, and especially from London, when you're in London, you see so many different cultures, people from different parts of the world. But it's so beautiful that although it has happened accidentally, not by design, but you have so many connections. Like, for example, the Indian community itself is in so many parts of the world playing such a vital role. And it's easy to connect. And, whether it's Caribbean, whether it's Middle East, whether it's Europe, whether it's Far East, and even in places in Americas, so it's such a world where you can get connected. You can find those common grounds. Yeah, like the name of your show. It's common ground everywhere. And the other side of it is that even with other communities, for example, when I see, I do work with a lot of different kind of people. So we're working with Costa Rica, for example, Costa Rica government and Costa Rica tourism. They sell pineapples and cassava into the UK in a big way, and they're the leaders, market leaders by far. They also have tourism. But the exciting part of this new world is that you have this whole idea that people are not isolated anymore. People are not kind of, this is, it's not like earlier it was like a different world where America was at the top and that cultural hegemony, and obviously then the tech hegemony, and then the economic hegemony, everything set there, and Americans were at the lead of the world. They were the ones who were doing things. You have different communities and different cultures and different ways of being. They can express themselves because that hegemony has to some extent been broken. And that's the beauty of UK as well. I mean, UK doesn't get enough credit for this, but it's a very, very, it's a big catalyst. There is a world they have also catalyzed, which has a lot more cultural vibrancy, which kind of makes it fluid, that you can be in different parts of the world doing different things, still keeping cultural connections. So it's a lot more exciting. It's the big news for me always is that it's no more that world of the past, which we have lived from the 70s when I was born till now, which had an overtly American kind of overtone. So I think that seems to have broken a lot. There's a lot more acceptance. Earlier people were all about, well, I mean, America is the thing. America is the power. America is driving this, but it's not anymore like that. And I wish people can see that now it's possible. Even now, you might have the big tech companies based out of the US, but in future, it might not be like that. And I think the flow of the capital also is going to be a lot more liberal and democratic. And for India, I think the opportunity is too big to miss. So India won't miss it. But while we are, a lot of people in India feel that they're having a civilizational moment politically because they have to kind of re-own what their culture and civilization means. But they also have to learn that actually a lot of that learning also has been through their association with the West. So it should not be an inward-looking society, wherein we're trying to give ourselves a myth that we're going to go back. There's no going back. It's in the present times we are living here, and while we can have all those great civilizational kind of you know assets or values, but there's no going back. This is a different world where we can be equals. Yeah, I think that equality mindset has to creep in. Yeah.
Correct. And that's a very profound note to conclude our conversation
Thank you.
today.
Thank you.
Very insightful and very heartfelt set of responses from you, Manish. Thank you for that. And thank you for making the time to be with us today. All the best for all your dreams, aspirations, and the good work that you will continue to do tomorrow.
Thank you. So this is what happens when you have a great person or a great facilitator like you. Great ideas come. So I have to leave it on that note that actually I felt so good talking to you. Yeah, and
Thank
there was
you.
a common ground. Yeah.
Thank you. There is always a
Thank
common
you.
ground.
Thank you.
This is it for today. We will be speaking to another interesting guest, a prominent voice from the UK India corridor at Common Ground, presented to you by me, Lakshmi Kaul, for Global Order. Stay tuned.